Welcome and good evening. My name is Corinne DeBray, and I'm Managing Director at the Foster. Thank you for coming. This evening, we're delighted to have Laurie Cullenward as part of our My Journey with Tony speaker series, and Laurie will discuss her time spent with Tony Foster diving in Little Cayman. She is a business process engineering and analysis manager at MAP in Palo Alto, who is also a scuba diver and an artist who works in ceramics. She also has spent time diving with Tony Foster in Little Cayman Island in the Caribbean and will share what it was like to work with Tony and watch him work underwater. So please give a warm welcome to Laurie Cullenward.
To dive is the most exquisite experience, and I thought if I could in any way convey that, the sheer beauty of it in a completely alien environment, then that would be a wonderful thing to do. It would bring joy to people, I thought. It brings joy to me. I'd been a scuba diver for many years. I used to go scuba diving a lot when I worked in the Cayman Islands in the West Indies for a couple of years, and I always loved it. And I did it every time I got the opportunity. And I was diving in Grenada, and the dive master, I was talking to him after the dive, and he said, well, if all your work's about wildernesses and wild places, the last real wild place left is underwater, because it's the last undiscovered part of the planet. So you ought to do work about that.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Laurie Cullenward. Thank you, Corinne, for the introduction, and thank you to the Foster for inviting me tonight to speak about the time I spent with Tony and Ann Foster in Little Cayman. It was actually 5 years ago that Tony and Ann were able to join myself and my family to scuba dive the reefs on the North Shore of Little Cayman. And it's just been really nice reflecting in the last few weeks about all the time we had together and the connection to this beautiful place. So how I got to know Tony was actually through, I work at MAP with Jane Woodward, and if you've ever visited our offices, Tony's work is throughout the entire floor. It's really inspiring and helps bring the outdoors for us. And I always really loved his work, and in the early days when he would come back from these journeys, Tony would come and give sort of lunch talks about where he's been and what he's been doing. And there was one afternoon he was coming back from working on sacred places, which is what we see around us here. And I was so struck by his conversation about where he was going next with beauty and what he was thinking about. And that he was really looking for the most beautiful places in the world and to follow those who are experts in that subject. And for some reason I got a whole bunch of confidence in me, and I walked right up to him and I said, I hope you're going to work on a coral reef and exploring beauty, and I just wanted to throw a place up there. If you're thinking about it, you should come visit the Cayman Islands, because it's really one of the last protected areas of the Caribbean. And everyone hears about the Great Barrier Reef, and there are wonderful places to go in the Indian Ocean as well, but this is a really special spot, and I knew that he had a connection there. And I had really taken to him, and he sort of liked the idea, and we sort of corresponded about it. And eventually, my family and I have been scuba diving there for the last 12 years. And so they felt comfortable. I hadn't even asked them, but I just sort of was like, hey, I have this very nice gentleman and his wife, and I hope you don't mind that they come and stay with us for a week. And luckily everyone got along super well, and Tony is just the most amazing guest. If you ever get to host him, it's a joy. But it was pretty funny just the way it all came together. And so if you see out there, the name you might see in the hallway is Sir David Attenborough, and he definitely did recommend the coral reefs. I think he stole my thunder a little here, but this is how he came to Little Cayman. So some of you guys might not know where this is in the world. So Little Cayman is about 70 miles south of Cuba. If you hear about the Cayman Islands, it might be related to maybe a cruise ship or maybe an offshore bank account. Most of that is around Grand Cayman down here, where Georgetown's the capital, and Little Cayman is just out here. You can't even see it under the star because it's only 11 miles long and 1 mile wide. It's really tiny, and it sits on top of the Cayman Trench here. So it's like an underwater mountain range that's actually the deepest point in the Caribbean. So the Cayman Trench is where the North American plate and the Caribbean plate meet. and it can reach depths of about 25,000 feet there. So you can just imagine this tiny little piece sticking out at the bottom of, at the top of the bottom underwater mountain range. And what makes it really special is that, you know, you have this really shallow water where you can have a coral reef that then fades into a deep trench. And so you can have a mixing of these tiny little creatures and then big pelagic animals like hammerhead sharks. Here is a close-up of the island itself. The remoteness of Little Cayman is what makes it really special, along with the protections that have been put in place here. So while Grand Cayman might be open to cruise ships and as many tourists as can fly in, Little Cayman is limited by an airport down here that you have to get there before dark. There are no lights. So that at least cuts out half the day for travelers. In addition, we have these marine parks here on the northern edge where there's no removal of fish, live or dead, or any sea creature, and that really keeps fishermen away and also attracts a whole lot of divers. So all the red flags you see out there are individual dive sites. There are about 60 on the island, and half of them are within the marine parks in the south and in the north. Pretty much everyone lives right down here. There are a few scattered homes individually around, but there are about 3 resorts and the airport and a grocery store and a church and a post office, and that is pretty much the whole town. So what you see around is pretty much open land. It's a wildlife preserve for iguanas and red-footed boobies, and then we also have a replenishment zone out here that is, you can't take lobster or conch. And so there are a lot of species that are just really thriving here. You see in numbers that you wouldn't see elsewhere. These 2 blue zones on the far edges of the island are grouper spawning sites, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later because it's an endangered species, the Nassau Grouper, that is really thriving in Little Cayman and disappearing throughout the Caribbean. So those are just special spots to keep in mind as we go on. So these parks promote conservation quite a bit, and there's no spearfishing allowed, which means that everyone's pretty much restricted to line fishing, so catches are really controlled. And as I mentioned, fish populations here are really thriving, as well as we have a huge collection of soft corals and sponges. So you might have recognized hard corals everywhere, that may be ones that look like big brains. We have fewer of those and more things that look like fans that move throughout the water that are really beautiful. And there are sort of 2 main sections of the kind of dive sites you might see here that are in the Northern Marine Park. And it divides in the western half that is called the Bloody Bay Wall, and then the eastern half, which is called Jackson's Bight. And the main difference between those is the Bloody Bay Wall is a 6,000-foot drop-off. It starts at about 30 feet, and it goes on forever. And it's really remarkable. It's where, you know, the outside really starts hitting Cayman Islands itself. So you can see down here, this is what a scuba diver will look like from looking out from the wall. It's just you in blue. And then this is kind of looking back at it. It's really hard to get good perspective shots of it because you're either right on it and you're looking at a reef as if it's, you know, just horizontal to you, or you're shooting back through so much blue. But it gives you a little bit of the scale of this mountain range. So you can imagine too, if you're gonna be painting underwater, maybe 6,000 feet isn't really the floor you're looking for. So this isn't a part of the park that we spent a lot of time in, but these are some of the creatures that you can see out here. We access these points through swim-throughs, and so you'll kind of dive through a chute, and you can run into creatures literally head-on as you're diving through. So I swam upon this guy as I was coming out to the wall. You can also run into these, and we get about 8-footers pretty regularly there. We have been seeing a rise in our shark population, as we have also seen the rise in an invasive species. The lionfish has come to the Caribbean, and even though we're working to try and prevent the spread of them, by taking and culling those fish from the reef, it attracts sharks because there's chum and things in the water that get them excited about feeding. So we're actually seeing a lot more sharks than we used to. But we can also see some really amazing, delicate guys as well. So this is at the bottom of a swim through. We came out to this seahorse. And it's always really exciting when you're underwater and something you've been searching for years just pops into view. And you can imagine all the bubbles and sort of like shaking of rattles that people are doing just to try and get attention, because, you know, this gets lost very easily unless you're focusing on exactly where that is. So the Bloody Bay Wall is an amazing spot, and it's world-renowned, and I really encourage people to go there. We concentrated most of our time in the Jackson Bight part of the park, which it's really more a traditional coral head and sand patch. So you're swimming around to find the pieces of the reef. It's not necessarily just right there in front of you like the wall is, but that also introduces a lot of tiny things and a lot of great coral. So this is one of my favorite species on the island. This is called a sharp-nosed pufferfish, and this is a juvenile with it, and I just love the markings on the eyes and the iridescence. This is just backlit around, sponge and calcareous algae, and these are about 2 inches long. This is a juvenile spotted drum. The symbol for this is drummer, like this, underwater, and you go for the little ones. And I just love the way that they swim with the 2 different fins. Like, one of my favorite things you'll see in Tony's paintings is he really caught the fact that every species swims differently. And where you catch them in a moment in time really shows you how they're moving. And so you can just see the gracefulness of this guy. This is a diamond blenny. And they've just got so much personality, and they're always propped up places kind of looking at you. And I just love it because it's in the sea anemone next to it, and again, perched on a sponge. So you're seeing a whole lot of biodiversity all at once there. And then this is one of my favorite little guys. If you can see, this is a piece of coral. These are the coral polyps. This is a sea fan behind it. And this is this tiny little slender filefish that if it turned to the side, it would disappear. And what's cool about these guys is they can actually change their texture and color to match their surroundings. So if it was down in the leafiness down here, it would become more grayish green, and it would actually open up some of its fins so that it looked more flowy. So that's just another one of the fun guys you can find down there. So there's Tony. So those were all the reasons I knew that I loved Little Cayman and that he would as well. And I knew that he had worked already in this medium, which is kind of crazy. He's doing watercoloring underwater. Doesn't make a lot of sense. I think if you've been to these series in the past, you might have heard about some of Tony's journeys that have been pretty extreme. He's probably gone out, if you heard about the Atacama Desert, camping and living on dried rations and just getting around. Tony got to come to Cayman Islands in the Caribbean and go scuba diving, so we made sure he was comfortable this one. All he had to do here was bring his own tea. So we tried to make sure he was outfitted, but it was really his show once we got there. So I think the main reason that I had so much fun with him was I really got to help Tony find the sites along the marine park that were going to work for his medium. So if you saw in the previous photo, he was sitting on the bottom, and that's why we couldn't go out to the Bloody Bay Wall and float out there in space, because he really needs to be weighted down and stay in the same spot. In addition to that, because these are marine parks, we're not supposed to touch the reef in any way. And so finding the loopholes with people to work in these barren areas so that we could set him up and not impact things around us was just part of our challenge. So luckily we were working with a great dive outfit down there, and the captain was super accommodating and really helped us complete our mission here. The main thing that I was worried about as a navigator was, first of all, we had to leave the boat and I had to get him back to it. That was the main thing. But even more than that, it was that he would set a profile for his dive, and I would go by and remind him in few-minute increments when we were finishing up. And I always knew that I had to give myself 5 minutes longer after the first dive, because Tony took a 35-minute dive to a 45-minute dive to a 48-minute dive to a, we have to go to our safety stop. So part of it is, he's in the moment down there and really enjoying what he's doing and has so much to do in 45 minutes. All of these other paintings you see are days and days of work, and he's trying to capture a feeling, a moment, and give himself enough clues to be able to take everything back above water and paint the final piece. So this was what it looked like when we took off. This is our first day. Tony's sitting down here. There's a dive master helping him out, and these guys are about to dive in. We had incredible luck that we actually found a seahorse on this first dive coming out of a swim through, just like that other one. And we also got to see this really cool free swimming Moray Eel, which you guys have probably seen their faces, and they are typically, they don't have very good eyesight. They like to hide in crevices, and this guy got spooked, and he's about 6 feet long. And so we just got to watch that swim through. And then this guy down here is actually the subject of the painting in the other room, and he is a Nassau Grouper, and again, that goes back to the spawning sites I mentioned on the island. This is an endangered species. You guys are probably familiar with grouper, but I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of meeting these guys because they're almost like puppies. And I mean that in that they come up to divers and they will bump you and they will ask to get petted and scratched. And they are completely wild creatures. And it's just, they're really friendly, they're really intelligent, they can live to be about 30 years old, and they're just one of the gems of Little Cayman. So we got to see all of this in our first day out. The first dive was really just to make sure that Tony got to see why we were there and what we were there to see. So part of what we got to really good at was kind of surveying the sites together, getting down in the first 5 minutes and staying high so we could look around and find the pockets where he could really get the depth of field that he wanted for his painting. Because as long as you're staying still underwater, the animal life will move back to you. But we needed to get something where you could get the multi-layers of the reef all together and then also have it be somewhere where he could kneel down. And so that was one of our good challenges, but every site that we went to, we ended up finding one. So I think he ended up doing about 6 sketches down here.
And so I devised this way of drawing underwater with Swiss Caran d'Ache crayons, which are slightly water-soluble, on architect's drafting film, which is like a plastic paper. And I had a plastic drawing board, and I would clip the paper onto it. I would go down and sit on the bottom in about 30 or 40 feet of water with a handful of Caran d'Ache crayons and extra weights on my weight belt so that I would sit solidly on the bottom instead of sort of washing around in the waves. And I would simply see if this would work. And I found it worked perfectly well. In fact, the fish at first would come swimming up towards you to see what you were doing there and sort of, behave differently. But then after a while, they get used to you being there and they just get on with their lives. And in fact, they're very straightforward to draw. The drawings themselves are, not botanically or biologically accurate because they can't be because you're sort of washing around like this. But on the other hand, I know what most of these fish look like. I've been diving for many years. And so it wasn't difficult for me to then translate them when I got back onto dry land onto making the big paintings that I did from the smaller sketches. So I loved using colors I seldom use, so these bright oranges and yellows and, just this brilliant, fantastic Winsor blues and stuff. So these are the pencils I use underwater. They're Caran d'Ache, very high quality Swiss crayons, and they come in different grades of solubility. So the ones you want are the kind of medium soluble ones. If they're too soluble, they just disappear off the paper. If they're not soluble enough, they're kind of too scratchy and don't really work. So you want the medium grade, because then if you make a terrible mistake, you can just brush it off the paper. And so those are the ones you want, and you get quite a nice effect with them, and it seems to work. In fact, the only problem I discovered really is that you hang on to your pencils, and you've got you're also holding onto the drawing board, and you're working away here, and then if you loosen your grip, your pencils immediately fly off up to the surface, and you can't chase after them because you would get an embolism, and so you have to just let them go. And so by the end of a couple of weeks drawing underwater, you're down to the yellow, the red, and the grey, and so you're around looking for fish which actually have got those colours on, because otherwise there's nothing, you haven't got anything left. But that's the only technical problem with it, I think.
So after diving together in the mornings, this is where you'd find Tony in the afternoons, is under this palm tree, and he would be filling in his sketch from that morning. So when he's down there, he doesn't have time to do all of the shading and coloration, and that's sort of what he does to meditate after on the dive that he had and what he saw. And it's a nice solo time that he really takes to think about what he wants to build throughout here, and it sets the scene in his memory because he doesn't take photographs of any of this. And actually, when I photographed him down there, I made sure not to share it with him because he didn't want to see or be tainted by any of that. He really goes off of what he experiences. So this is the work that came out of our time together in Little Cayman. It really is the culmination of the dive. So if you've looked at his other work here, when you're looking at the sky, for instance, it's a combination of many days and his experience. And I think you see the same thing here. That's not as if all these fish are flying across his view shed at once, but while he was sitting there over the 30 minutes, this is everyone who came by. And I love just the layering of the fish in the foreground and the light up top and how you can still see the schools behind. And he really did a great job of capturing the sponges, which is something that we're really known for, and then also the Nassau Grouper here in the middle, which is kind of, I'd consider the fish of Little Cayman. And just as I mentioned before, if you look at that way that all the different fish are swimming, you can see the turn of this yellow-tailed snapper here versus the squirrelfish kind of eerily peering out at you, trying to make eye contact, and just seeing how they all move around here, he definitely captured them. And this is the details of the sketch that he did while he was underwater. And then this is the profile of his dive log. So the dive site was Jigsaw, which was actually in the Bloody Bay part of the park, but it's at a shallower depth. So it had that nice craggy, sandy ground for him. One thing that I would point out that this is the only souvenir that came along with this painting. And if you look around, you see Tony typically takes things from sites. And what I really like is that, he didn't bring anything back here except the dive log and the memories. There's a whole lot that we need to be concerned about around conservation and preservation. And I think he's just really putting a nice note on the fact that this is something to be visited and not taken from. And not taken for granted. Because I think at the beginning, you all might have heard that Tony had been down in the West Indies in the Cayman Islands in the 70s. And so when he lived on Grand Cayman with his wife, I imagine it looked quite a bit more like what Little Cayman looks like today. And so in the passages of his lifetime, he has seen the reefs of Grand Cayman disappear, and we're hoping to keep the ones of Little Cayman safe. So here are a few more photos of Tony diving, and when he sort of is describing about becoming part of the landscape, I really loved this particular dive because you can see up top here, these are ocean triggerfish. So these are fish that come from the pelagic area, so off of the wall. They come from really deep and they swim in open water. They're not reef fish. And they're coming in to play with the bubbles because Tony's sitting there. And then down here is actually a juvenile grouper. And so he really had a great experience with the grouper. That was the subject of his painting. And I don't think he ever even saw this guy that was watching him the whole time. And it also just speaks to, you're seeing what you can see while you're down there, but it's teeming with life. You never know what's behind your shoulder. And it really is never enough time. I think Tony's work really is about sharing wonders and about sharing the message of protecting nature and conservation. And so I hope some of these have shown a different undersea world that you all might not have known about before and that you're inspired to help protect. So these are the Nassau Groupers when they are in their spawning stage. So this is what those squares look like on the edges of the island, usually around January and the full moon. So there are thousands of Nassau Grouper that come to congregate there, and they are just from around the island. These aren't from other places in the Caribbean. These are just our groupers, which is incredible to behold. And there are a lot of marine institutes that are now on the island that are working to study and protect these guys. Unfortunately, since I started down there, this spawning area has gone extinct, and we are down to just this last one. There used to be 5 on the island. This is a study that you guys can see. This is from 2006, and if you watch the western edge of the island, each dot represents a Nassau Grouper that is tagged with a geotag. And as we approach the full moon, which is going to happen about the 16th of January, the colors are showing you night to day, but see everybody showing up in that corner. And literally every single one will come from far, far off island. And when I say off island, it just means deep. It doesn't mean that they're going far. It just means they're going away from there. But that's the main spawning, and that was the full moon, and then they all depart. So just in the studies that have been done since 2006, as I mentioned, we found that all of these are groupers that have been tagged from Little Cayman and are remaining around Little Cayman. So when people took photographs of those spawnings in the past, we weren't sure where those fish had come from. What if they were from Cuba? What if they were from Jamaica? These are all fish that are really closely located with the island, which means they're ours to protect and to study. And there are just a few more facts up there about the prevalence of this, but I think the most interesting one is just that we used to have these 5 major sites where these aggregations would happen, and we're just down to 1.
Did you say they're tagged?
They're tagged, yeah, they are. Yeah, so they've just got sorry? There's a marine institute down there called the Central Caribbean Marine Institute, and it's a collection of scientists that help to study mostly the grouper, but also many of the other creatures around the reef. And they've been especially helpful in combating the lionfish invasions. Yes?
Figured out why they go down there and don't in other places?
The question was why the fish are spawning where they are. All of the spawning sites were near very deep edges of the island, so we think that they were just really cool water, open sites that were attracting them. There wasn't a lot of boat traffic, it wasn't shallow, so it was safe. But there's a lot more that can be read up about this on the Grouper Moon Project. Reef.org is one of the main institutions off island that is also supporting these studies. So the Nassau Grouper is, a lot of people in a lot of places are looking to protect it.
Do you think that the other site disappeared because everybody went out there to see this spawning thing?
The question was if the other site disappeared because people went out to go see it. It's a good question. I'm not sure. Really, we are trying to figure out why certain sites are used and if they do go extinct, if that's permanent. But not sure of the reason why it stopped being used.
Oh, maybe it's related to the shark.
Could be. There you go. Exactly. So we've talked a lot about scuba diving and why Tony came to dive here, and I'm just going to highlight one last area that is really important to the overall ecosystem, and that's this place that we call Inside the Cut here. So this light blue area is much shallower water. It's very sandy. You can find some turtles and eagle rays in there. It probably gets to about 20 feet, 40 feet at its deepest. But why it's really important is it connects with the coastline, and it serves as a nursery for fish so that they can grow up and then exit to the coral reefs. So what you see on the left here is a juvenile smooth trunkfish. And it is about the size of your fingernail. And it floats around like a little ping pong ball, and it's just about the cutest fish you'll ever see. But it's really hard to find and cannot be in big open water where something could just open its mouth and swallow it. It needs to be in shallow water and protected with lots of seagrass and mangroves. So that area that is really only snorkelable is actually still a really cool place to explore the underwater world. And it's a place that after we go diving in the mornings, my family and I like to go down there and explore. You'll see this is a little juvenile banded butterfly fish, which is in the lower right-hand corner of his painting. You'll see a grown-up one of those if you check out his full work. But I also love this picture because this is new coral growth. And this is area that was really ravaged by Hurricane Ivan, and everything was gone. And this has grown in the time that I've been there. And so you can see that there is regeneration, and this is where coral reefs want to be. And life exists even if it looks sort of like bleak rubble. And then this is one thing that I have not seen scuba diving, but I will give this to snorkeling. I can now see these guys almost every time we go out, and they are one of my favorite creatures, and that's the octopi. And this is just one few minutes right before sunset. You can see the light hitting it with all of that lovely rainbow refraction, and watching this guy change colors and move away from me it was just a gorgeous thing to behold. So I hope you all have been somewhat inspired to maybe get a mask on and go underwater. And I just want to end this by just saying a quick thank you, because my parents were so accommodating in inviting the Fosters in, and they are the ones who brought me to scuba diving and also, got me in the water with a camera. And so in honor of my mom especially, these are some of my favorite octopi photos, but this one is hers. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And